Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's SANS Threat Analysis Rundown live stream. I'm Katie Nichols. I'm a SANS instructor for Forensics 578, also Director of Intelligence for Red Canary, and a Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I'm so excited to be here with you today after a little bit of a summer break from the live stream. Excited to be back with you to talk about all of the things related to threats. I see we have folks from around the world joining us. So happy that you are here today. Got lots of topics to cover. Been a busy couple months as always. So let's go ahead and dive right in. First off, let's talk about SOAs. That's how I say it. PSOAS. SOA standing for Private Sector Offensive Actor. So I wanted to talk about this a little bit because there's an interesting congressional hearing on this and some threat reporting just a couple weeks ago. So as we go through the links today, I'm going to try something different with our live stream. If you've joined before, I usually share the links afterwards, but I get it. People want to follow along. So bear with us if it doesn't work. What I'm going to try to do is, as I'm talking about these different links, drop these in chat so you can follow along. So we'll see how this goes, but first thing I wanted to cover is this Duo article from the folks at Decipher about this congressional hearing. I think one of the things that I'm passionate about, I think it's really important, is that cybersecurity practitioners talk to people who are making policies about cybersecurity, right? What a thought. And I think this is a great recent example of that happening. A couple of experts from private sector, including Shane Huntley from Google, went to the US Congress and explained, the risk of these commercial spyware vendors, the private sector offensive actors. So this article provides kind of a summary of what these testimonies in front of US Congress were about, right? So if you're not familiar with SOA's private sector offensive actors, these are also sometimes referred to as mercenary groups. Some examples, you might have heard of the NSO group. They're kind of famous or infamous for their Pegasus spyware that affects mobile devices. Candiru, another one. And these actors, what they do is they will sell offensive capabilities, spyware, malware, exploits, and services to lots of different organizations. Sometimes different governments around the world will use these. And one of the concerns with private sector offensive actors is that a lot of times governments in different countries will use them to target people like journalists or activists or dissidents who disagree with that regime. And so this is one of these things where it is an ethical debate I absolutely cannot answer for you. Is it okay to have these commercial services providing these exploits, these offensive capabilities to these different governments around the world? Right? Think about whatever your country of origin is, right? you found out your government was going after some terrorists with capabilities from one of these mercenary groups. Would you be okay with that? Right? They're going after terrorists. So maybe the means is okay. But what if they're going after dissidents, right? Human rights activists, that kind of thing. So it's a really interesting ethical debate. Again, I can't answer that for you, but I think there's an interesting angle here about how these commercial services really make it easier for anyone to get into the offensive cyber game, right? You can just hire someone else to go after whoever you want rather than having to develop those capabilities themselves. So, right, this hearing really focused on, a lot of the concerns and abuses of these technologies. Right? When we talk about NSO group, Candiru, these other mercenary groups, a lot of times, as I mentioned, they do go after people like human rights activists. And kind of a cool thing, one of the people who testified in front of Congress was actually a victim of NSO group, right? Talking about his story being targeted. So, kind of an interesting example of cybersecurity practitioners informing policy. And if you like congressional hearing records, I know you need some light bedtime reading. There's a link to the full committee hearing, right? I mentioned one of the witnesses, Shane Huntley, really, really smart guy, in charge of the threat analysis group over at Google. And then John from the Citizen Lab, right? If in your threat model, if you feel like these mercenary groups are something that your organization needs to track, the Citizen Lab is a great resource for reporting on these different groups. So, some light reading, congressional testimony, but it is worth a read or a watch later on. So, interestingly, one of the things we've seen from Microsoft and other companies is, right, them getting involved and having opinions on policy issues. This was a blog post from Kristen Goodwin, who super smart lawyer type. Highly recommend following her on Twitter. This was the same day that those congressional hearings came out. Microsoft issued this blog post from Kristen about how they feel like these cyber weapons that are in these commercial hands, right, are a threat to different governments, businesses, victims, etc. So, kind of an interesting example of a private company in cybersecurity taking a stand on an issue. And you've seen Microsoft do this in the past as well. Along with this statement and the congressional hearing, Microsoft also released a blog post on a group that they call Knotweed. So this is where we go kind of from the high level strategic policy angle, right? There were hearings on this, trying to inform policymakers of maybe they should better regulate these types of tools and entities. And then we go down to more of the operational and tactical level with some specifics from the awesome Mystic and Microsoft Security Response Center on a specific group called Knotweed. So Knotweed, one of the Microsoft names. And as we said, right, SOAs, that's one term for these groups. Cyber mercenaries is another one, basically hacker for hire services. So Knotweed is actually attributed to an Austrian-based group named DSIRF. And you can go to their actual website. This is an organization that says they provide services to multinational corporations in technology, right? It's kind of funny because some of these descriptions sound very much like any other cybersecurity services vendor. So, also the interesting thing I found was kind of interesting that they're based in Austria. That's not really a country that I feel like we talk a whole lot about in terms of the cybersecurity space. So, DSIRF, the entity behind Knotweed. And this blog details various malware and techniques used by this group, including one called Sub-Zero. So if you haven't looked at Microsoft blog posts before, they are a wealth of knowledge. And hats off to the team who produced these. Those of you who don't write blog posts every day, like these take a lot of work to produce. And so it talks about initial access, some of the exploits they've used, right? All of these techniques that potentially defenders could start to track. One of the things that I really like in Microsoft blog posts, in addition to their kind of breakdowns of TTPs, is that if you scroll to the very bottom, They have, right, indicators of compromise. We as defenders really like those IOCs so we can do some research, maybe validate the malware analysis ourselves. And they also talk about detection. Okay, if you're using Microsoft products, right here in the names where you might detect some of the implants and tools from this group, also gives a breakdown of, right, here are some of the behaviors that they talk about earlier, the tactics, techniques, and procedures from this group. And this is a great place to look for detections, even if you are not a Microsoft Defender for Endpoint customer, right? It's a really important point that, okay, Microsoft is detecting these techniques in their products, but even if you don't have Microsoft, you can do this yourself, right? Suspicious curl behavior detects the use of curl to download not read tooling from public file shares, right? Curl's built-in Windows tool, should that in any network be downloading things from external sites? Maybe in your network that's normal, but that's an example of something that you could try to look for in your organization, right? Similarly, down here, they have specific queries. These are targeted at Microsoft Sentinel, but what you can do is, right, take a look at the logic and then translate that to your own environment, right? You might have to know some KQL, their query language, but, right, you could figure out what are they trying to look for here and then translate that into your own environment, whatever logs or tooling you have. So, just kind of a nice example of how Microsoft providing these queries, these techniques can translate into hunting opportunities, detection opportunities, regardless of the products you're using, right? And some of these might look familiar if you've looked at different TTPs before, right? Using comservices.dll to dump credentials from memory. This is a technique that a lot of different adversaries use. Which brings us to a point that if you've joined us for live streams before, right, this is something that we see a lot of actors do. So, trying to detect credential dumping is probably good, whether you're trying to detect mercenary groups like Knotweed, or state sponsored groups, or criminal groups, red teams, etc. So, just this idea that it's really important to look at the techniques that a lot of different adversaries are using and make sure you detect those. The other point I want to touch on here is threat modeling, right? It's something we talk about quite a bit, and there are lots of definitions, but I think of threat modeling as really prioritizing the threats your organization should care most about because there are so many out there. So, thinking about these mercenary groups, right? Organizations that probably should prioritize Knotweed or other groups are going to be orgs like, right, if you're supporting journalists or if you're a human rights organization, right? Those are the types of organizations that commonly are targeted by these mercenary groups. Take a look at some of the comments and questions. Ooh, this is an interesting one from AJV. Don't governments illegally collect information like this all the time? Why would we want them to have an even greater monopolized influence? That's the ethical question, right? And this gets into kind of a broader debate about, right, what types of activities are allowable in cyberspace if you believe in international law, right? So there's one school of thought that says, okay, in terms of espionage, governments spy on each other, right? It's accepted. So maybe if you're, using cyber operations for espionage purposes, okay, that's maybe allowable under international law. Where there maybe is a gray area where you might think differently is, okay, if a government isn't using these offensive capabilities for espionage purposes, they're using it to target individuals they disagree with, right? That might be a different type of question where you might think that these cyber capabilities could be used under different circumstances. What's allowable? And that's a debate that a lot of people have in the cybersecurity space and the international relations space, right? As organizations are making foreign policy. So, interesting one there. All right. So I've rambled a little bit, but this is a great blog post. Definitely check this one out from Knotweed from Microsoft. Lots of actionable TTPs that you can use from this one. Highlighted the KQL queries, right? Again, you can translate those. Wade commenting, surprised they didn't use attack or Sigma alerts. Yeah, some orgs will map to Sigma, that kind of standardized rule format for different SEMs. Sometimes, right, That's sort of an extra step that they don't get to. But you could absolutely map a lot of these to Sigma yourself. Wrapping up our mercenary hacker for hire section, I mentioned one of the more famous hacker for hire groups is NSO Group. And they were just in the news this week as some folks saying, are they imploding? Right. So the CEO of NSO Group announced that they were stepping down. Also, there's some word that about 100 employees are being laid off as part of a reorg. So some people are kind of watching this and saying, is this a sign that maybe NSO Group is shutting down or reducing their operations? Is it possible that things like that congressional testimony, right, had an influence on them? Are they feeling the heat from someone somewhere and starting to decrease operations? I would say it's probably too early to tell, right? But it's worth watching, right? These operations of these groups, these companies, and seeing what they're doing. Are they reducing their workforce? Are there changes that might indicate some kind of shift in what they're doing? All right, so that is our mercenary wrap up. I'll drop that Reuters link as well if you want to check out that recent news on NSO Group. All right, moving on to our next topic. And if this is your first live stream, I have to introduce one of my favorite Google Chrome features, tab groups. This might change your life. I know you came here for the cyber threat stuff, but it's really nice because you can like collapse different groups. So as we move on from talking about SOAs, right, I can collapse that group. So you're welcome. Google Chrome tab groups, go try them out. Another thing that's been in the news lately, and this is another one with kind of interesting international relations overlaps, is the news that Lloyd's, one of the big insurance providers, is going to exclude insurance coverage for any nation backed cyber attacks. Now, it's worth noting that this isn't necessarily a new thing, right? So this has just been gaining some coverage in the past few days, this past week, because Lloyd's has made this announcement. But this discussion has been going around for a while, right? I'll drop in a link to a 2020 post from John Bateman talking about, does your cyber insurance cover a state-sponsored attack? This is a topic that has been in discussion for the past couple years. And the gist of this is that, right, insurance companies, I think, are starting to be a little more thoughtful about what they cover or not. And one of the things that Lloyd's is saying is that if it is state sponsored, they're not going to pay out insurance coverage for those types of attacks. Now, there's a very interesting debate here of what is defined as a nation-backed cyber attack, right? If you've joined us before, you might have heard we talk about the spectrum of state responsibility, which is a really neat paper from Jay Healy, who's at the Atlantic Council, that talks about how there's sort of a spectrum of different things we might mean when we say state-sponsored, right? And the Wall Street Journal article touches on this concept, right? What's would be the line between a criminal group acting in support of some country versus, right, the government themselves going after a target? This is the idea that, right, sometimes there might be actors who are sort of influenced by a government saying, oh, it would be okay if you went after that organization, but the government isn't doing it themselves. Well, would that be a state-sponsored, a nation-backed cyber attack? That definition kind of gets a little bit messy. And yeah, really, really great comment from Michael there. Could be tough to attribute in some cases, right? Some adversaries might work for the government during the day and then moonlight working for a criminal group or for their own personal benefit, financial gain. Where do you draw the line there? Right? Really, really great question. And that attribution question is a really important one. And this is where I think this is really actionable for any Intel analysts out there who do any type of attribution. If you've joined the live stream or watched me talk before, attribution is a fun topic. And I would argue there are different types of attribution, right? You could attribute activity to malware, but most people think about attribution as attributing to like a person, a country, etc. This is a really important case where I would highly recommend if your team is doing any kind of attribution, especially to a country, go talk to your lawyers. Because this is an example of how, if you're doing attribution to a country, that could have real implications for cyber insurance payouts. For example, right, if you are, a incident response company, right, who comes in and you're helping out your client figure out what happened in a cyber incident, and your intel team, right, they say we want to know who did it, and your intel team attributes it to a certain country, is it possible that your team's analysis could be used to deny them insurance payouts? I feel like this is an area where no one really knows. There have been a couple case studies over the years, but this is an area where I'd highly recommend talking to your attorneys if you do this kind of work and thinking about that, right? And yeah, cyber insurance getting a lot of focus. And Tom, I feel like you have a background in insurance here. I think you make some great points here, right? Maybe this is inevitable because as people are filing more insurance claims, the insurance companies have to, right, manage their risk. All about quantifying risk and figuring out the liability they're willing to accept. So, yeah, Tom, I think that's a great point where sometimes we in cybersecurity, we focus on like cybersecurity has these unique problems of, right, attributing cyber attacks. Well, insurance 101, we can maybe look to other insurance areas, car insurance, home insurance, etc., for some of those lessons. So, this is definitely one to watch. And I think many people will be watching to see um, if there are interesting case studies where Lloyds or other insurers will deny coverage from nation backed cyber attacks. And yeah, Wade making a great point. Maybe people will be less likely to perform attribution. Maybe it's a case where you're just like, la, 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 you cover your ears. I don't want to know because if I don't know, then my insurance company won't deny me. A lot of interesting questions here. All right. So insurance market worth keeping an eye out, especially if your organization has cyber insurance, thinking about the cases where you may or may not get a payout. On the topic of insurance, let's move on to a recent incident that a lot of people were chatting about over the past couple weeks. Cisco. Cisco got compromised. They admitted freely that they had a cyber attack on themselves. And one thing I would highly recommend is remembering that those of us who are reading about this cyber attack, we are in what I call the cheap seats, right? We did not have to live through this. We don't know the full details. So, anytime you're kind of looking at an incident in someone else's organization, remember that you don't know everything, right? Have a little bit of a slice of humble pie here. So, my opinion is that Cisco did a nice job responding to this, right? They shared in this blog post the details of what happened. They also released a statement, right, explaining what happened. I think these kind of intrusions, they really suck. And I think the reality of the world we live in is that every organization is going to get compromised somehow at some point. It's all about how you respond that matters. So I know some folks at Cisco. I know this was a tough one, but I think what I'd recommend focusing on is their awesome write up here about what happened during this. So you can think about how could we prevent, detect, or respond to this if it happened to us? A couple interesting things to point out here. First off, one thing that a lot of people kind of missed is that, right, Cisco did work to remediate this, right? And I think it's important, again, from the outsider perspective, we don't know everything that happened. So if you read through this blog post, right, you'll note that they identified some of this activity and then worked on remediating it, right? As the adversary escalated to admin privileges, their security incident response team was alerted and started responding to the incident. So, this initial access vector definitely worth paying attention to here. Zoom in a little bit for you. So, this is something that we've started to see across various incidents, right? Adversaries trying to bypass multi factor authentication. Multi factor authentication fatigue. This is something we've seen from different groups, including Lapsus and others. This is where an adversary will send a whole bunch of push requests. For example, if you're using a multi-factor authentication tool and you push requests to an employee's phone, right? Maybe they choose in the middle of the night, they're just going to push a whole lot of requests as they're trying to bypass this multi-factor in the hopes that, I'm going to wake up tired and I just look at my phone and be like, yeah, whatever, go back to bed. So this is one that we've started to see a couple times, and I think it's a good example of adversaries responding to what defenders are doing. I think the good news is that more and more organizations are implementing multi-factor authentication. And right, I know CISA has really kind of emphasized this more than a password, and that's great. And I think the lesson isn't, well, adversaries can bypass multi-factor, so don't use it. No, it's definitely use multi-factor, but then on top of that, after you've implemented it, think about how you can protect against some of these things, right? That adversaries are doing to try to bypass it. So, this is one to be aware of, right? Also, vishing, using social engineering techniques where adversaries will call up employees, trying to trick them into divulging sensitive information. Enrolling new devices into multi-factor authentication services, that might be another thing to look for, right? Are there certain patterns you could look for in what devices should or shouldn't be enrolled, for example? So, an interesting example, multi-factor authentication bypass, I think something that is worth looking into after you've implemented MFA to start. Moving on to the post-compromise TTPs. This is where we get into TTPs that adversaries use over and over. And again, right, it sounds like from the blog post, Cisco detected these, which is awesome. And I think this is worth looking at because a lot of these are very, very detectable, especially if you have some kind of endpoint telemetry, whether it's a commercial tool or Sysmon, etc. Right? For example, dumping NTDS, right? That's a common technique adversaries will do, especially after they get access to a domain controller. So that's something you might be able to try to detect. Doing some different discovery or looking for different users, right? Creating users. Creating a user called Z. That's kind of weird. Maybe that's something you could look out for. So lots of different techniques here. Hey, funny enough, comm services DLL. We just saw that in that Knotweed blog post. This is a really common method that a lot of adversaries use to dump credentials. So, again, I highly recommend looking through this blog post, thinking about what are the things that you could detect, right? Maybe you aren't at a place in maturity where your org could try to detect multi factor authentication bypasses. Okay, if not, the good news is you can try to detect a lot of these post compromise TTPs as well. So, worth checking that one out. And my opinion, I think Cisco did a good job responding to this incident. Happens to everyone. Moving right along here, I've entitled this section Russia ish things. So, another Microsoft blog post on a fun named group, Seaborgium. Microsoft uses Elements, and Seaborgium was not one I was familiar with, but this one is interesting. Again, thinking about all the different techniques that adversaries are using that we need to try to detect and protect against. Right? So, Seaborgium is the Microsoft name, but one thing I really liked from here, they gave call outs to friends. Google Threat Analysis Group and Proofpoint, they collaborated, which is awesome. You love to see examples of different teams with different visibility cooperating to track these different adversaries. So, Seaborgium, very persistent threat actor. We'll talk about naming in a little bit. That name overlaps with some different groups tracked by different teams. And this blog post, right, rather than some of those endpoint techniques, credential dumping, talks about some different techniques that Seaborgium has used, right? Trying to do reconnaissance of individuals, sort of the first stage of adversaries' life cycle. They try to learn about their targets. Looks like this group uses social media platforms. Not surprising to try to gather information about their targets. Identified some fraudulent LinkedIn profiles. So maybe this is something for user awareness efforts to make sure your users know that adversaries are also lurking out there on LinkedIn. Right? Other things that Seaborgium does, right? Okay, they have to deliver some kind of malicious content, URL in the body of a phishing email. Pretty normal there, right? One of the things that's kind of interesting here as we look at the different techniques, they abuse OneDrive, right, to host PDF files. And this is something that is worth watching and educating users about because a lot of users, right, they're trained to, oh, like hover over the link and see is it scarylooking Well, if a user hovered over this link, they would see it goes to OneDrive. No problem, right? So educating users that just because it's hosted on OneDrive doesn't mean it's legit. So, various methods, credential theft, something that adversaries do just in different ways, right? In this case, capturing credentials entered by a user, exfiltrating data. This is another one that's kind of interesting to look at how they did this, right? Exfiltrating emails from inboxes or setting up forwarding rules in email accounts. This is something that I don't know about you, right? Sometimes I don't check one email address. I want to forward it all to my other email address, but this is something that adversaries have done for a long time is they'll set up rules that say, "Hey, send all of the inbound emails to this inbox to this other email address that the adversaries control." This might be something you could look for, right? Maybe you consider locking this down or just trying to alert whenever this happens in your organization because it's something that adversaries do. So, kind of a neat example of Seaborgium, a likely a Russian aligned actor. Another Russian group, classic APT29. This Microsoft blog post talks about another sort of cloud based set of techniques, APT29, targeting Microsoft 365, Office 365. So, various methods here, disabling licenses. This is kind of an interesting one, right? An adversary kind of messing with the license feature to try to disable some of the auditing. Again, things that you could look out for. And in this blog post, Mandiant has a link to some hardening strategies for Microsoft 365. Another cool thing that a lot of people miss from this blog post, heads up, thank you to my teammate Jimmy who pointed it out. Microsoft, or Mandiant rather, 2Ms, actually has this GitHub repo where they have a whole bunch of details about some of the PowerShell modules you could use to try to detect these techniques in Azure Active Directory. So this is kind of neat. It says in the description, UNC 2452, which, as you might recall, UNC 2452, that was the kind of initial uncategorized group that Mandiant tracked as being behind SolarWinds. That was later merged into the umbrella of APT29. So this is a really great resource. Hats off to Mandiant for releasing this. Right, this might be something that you could use to try to figure out how exactly do we detect these different techniques in Azure Active Directory. So, a couple interesting Russia things, Russia-ish things, and some examples of different techniques adversaries operating in different software as a service platforms like Microsoft 365 and Azure Active Directory. All right, moving right along from our Russia-ish things. Got to talk about ransomware. We talk about it every single month for good reason. It's still out there, right? We see lots of folks debating is ransomware getting better? Is it getting worse? I think the real answer is no one really knows, but it's still pretty bad. I dropped a link into this Sophos blog post, which is an interesting one because it's an example of something that some people call a magnet target, right? A single organization, an automotive supplier, was hit by 3 different ransomware actors. Lockbit, which is Lockbit 3.0 is pretty bad right now, Hive, and Black Cat. Pretty fascinating. And this is an example of something you might encounter that if organizations are, they have something like RDP access open to the internet, not secured with a second factor, that's a great opportunity for adversaries to get into that network. Sometimes you might find multiple different adversaries getting in on that action, right? So this was a fascinating case study, single entry point, 3 different adversaries across 2 weeks. The good news, however, is again, a lot of this stuff is very, very detectable. So this is an interesting case study, but we find even though it was 3 different actors, right? Sounds kind of scary. They use Mimikatz. Talked about credential dumping, right? PS exec, one of those living off the land binaries adversaries use for lateral movement, disseminating binaries. Mega, one of the cloud storage services. One of the things we've seen time and time again is adversaries like to use Mega or other services for exfiltration. So, again, just another example of how, all right, yeah, this outcome sucks, 3 different actors in, but there are lots of ways that you could detect these adversaries, even if they get into your network. Thinking about ransomware more broadly, right? I mentioned that there's a lot of kind of debate right now. Is ransomware getting better? Is it getting worse? And as I said, my opinion is we aren't totally sure. ENISA, the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, I'd highly recommend following their work. They put out a lot of awesome reports. They have one of my favorites on threat intelligence platforms. And this is a recent report that they released on trying to measure the threat landscape of ransomware attacks, right? And their headline here sort of highlights the key takeaway. Publicly reported ransomware incidents are only part of the overall picture. This is a persistent problem in trying to measure ransomware is that we only know about what we know about, which seems obvious, but those ransomware attacks that are reported publicly or that are on adversaries' leak sites, right? Those dark web sites where they leak victim data, those are only part of what's really happening out there, right? There is no one in the world who has visibility into every single ransomware incident. And I think until there's progress in that, until there's some kind of central reporting authority or more centralized reporting, I think it's going to continue to be really, really tough for us as a community to know if ransomware is getting better or not. So, worth a read, that ENISA report. Another interesting one I wanted to highlight. This is a little bit of, my interest in it. Might have seen it. Anyone who's tracking Raspberry Robin. So, Raspberry Robin, it's an activity cluster involving a worm that my team at Red Canary initially released research on. I should give credit to the folks at Sequoia who found it, released information first, called it QNAP worm. We didn't realize that. But Raspberry Robin is a cluster that seen a lot of across a lot of organizations. And the really weird thing about Raspberry Robin has been that no one's really seen a whole lot of follow-on activity, right? It looks like it gets on victims via USBs, and then it kind of like makes some network connections, and no one really knew what it did next. So really interesting. In July, Microsoft came out with this research, and they updated this blog post on ransomware as a service with some findings that this group they're tracking, Dev0206, right, was involved in deploying fake updates, also known as SOC Golish, which then leads to activity resembling Dev0243. Numbers are hard. So, long story short, looks like Raspberry Robin infections, Microsoft has seen those leading to fake updates malware, also known as SOC Golish. That's interesting because SOC Golish has been seen as a precursor for ransomware before, right? And it's tracked under the umbrella, Microsoft calls it Dev0243, known by some orgs under the moniker Evil Corp. So kind of interesting because Raspberry Robin is on a lot of networks. And if Raspberry Robin can lead to the SOC Golish malware, which has previously led to ransomware, could that mean Raspberry Robin could lead to ransomware? I think Microsoft presents evidence to suggest that might happen. I haven't yet seen anything that ties together a full Raspberry Robin infection all the way to the end where there's actual encryption exfiltration from ransomware, but it's possible. So this is something that's definitely worth keeping an eye on. Raspberry Robin, what it's doing, what's the nature of its relationship with these other groups. So we'll see. And if there's more developments in future months, I'll be sure to bring that up in future streams. All right, moving right along from ransomware. Let's talk about some different file formats, including ISOs. So one blog post that I highly recommend taking a look at is this one from Proofpoint. And I really like this because it takes a bit of a step back from the day to day. We're seeing this malware. It looks at kind of trends overall, right? And how adversaries might be changing to, based on Microsoft's decision to block macros by default in Microsoft Office. So we know, right? Microsoft made that decision a couple months ago, then they reverted it temporarily. And now I think they're back to blocking macros by default. And what Proofpoint researchers found is that it looks like adversaries are actually changing up what they're doing, potentially in response to that decision by Microsoft, which kind of makes sense, right? Adversaries watch what we as defenders are doing. And if they see, dang, my macro malware isn't working anymore, they're going to try something different. And so that's what Proofpoint has started to see. And not just Proofpoint has seen this, right? My team, researchers from across the community, have seen similar patterns. Container files, for example, ISO file types are a really popular choice right now for adversaries. A couple different examples. Another Proofpoint blog, TA558, one of the groups tracked by Proofpoint. They use lots of different malware, VJ Worm, Revenge Rat, others, right? TA558 is an example of a group that has started using different file types, right? They've been around for a while. You see, all right, they've used macro-laden Proofpoint attachments in the past, Microsoft Word, etc. Right? Through in 2020, though, right? Still using those malicious Microsoft Office documents with macros, scrolling through, tracking campaigns over time, right? And then what we see is the adversaries start to shift. Looking into 2022, changing up their delivery mechanisms, using URLs, ISO attachments, Office documents as well. And so TA558 is just an example of one actor group who's really shifting over time in response to the macro blocking. So, interesting example. And this is one, again, thinking about your threat model. If you're in the hospitality industry or travel industry, those are common targets for TA558. So, worth keeping an eye on. Another malware family that really has enjoyed using ISOs for their initial access is Bumblebee. This is a loader I think we've talked about in previous months, right? I'll drop a couple different links for you to read more about Bumblebee. Bumblebee is a loader that can load all kinds of bad payloads, right? So we'll start with this blog post from Cyber Reason, and I really like this graphic. Graphic artists, if you have any on your teams, they're worth their weight in gold, right? Really simply breaks down, okay, user, they're delivered an archive, a zip file, reaches out to a website, then an ISO file gets dropped. Contains a link file that eventually leads to execution and that Bumblebee DLL. So another interesting thing about these ISO files is that, I feel like as a security community, we've educated users. Watch out for suspicious Microsoft Office documents, right? Word documents, PowerPoints. Do average users know what an ISO is? Right? That's my hypothesis is why maybe some adversaries are having success with these ISO images is that a lot of users have no idea what ISOs are. And maybe they don't know that this could be something malicious. So they're like, cool, I don't know what this is. Great, something new and different. So just a hypothesis. But Bumblebee is one that sort of ebbed and flowed and they were kind of quiet for a little bit. But it's another one of these loaders that seems like it might lead to a ransomware later on. So worth keeping an eye on this one. Of course, the DFIR report, excellent resource that talks about some similar TTPs. And Brad from Unit 42 has this awesome blog post also on Bumblebee. And of course, Brad is One of those researchers you should definitely follow on Twitter, read his stuff, and he breaks down Bumblebee from his perspective. In this Unit 42 blog post, one of the things you might notice is another group name here, right? Among the threat actors distributing Bumblebee is Projector Libra, criminal group known by others, including Google, as Exotic Lily. Now, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I want to talk briefly about names, like this one from Unit 42, Projector Libra. The naming discussion is one of those things that every couple months, I feel like the community kind of has debates over on Twitter. And right, I've talked about this quite a bit in the past, but one school of thought is that each team that identifies groups has slightly different visibility and different methodology. And so there are good reasons why different teams have different names for these things. Another school of thought is this is stupid and confusing, and I don't want to keep track of 18 different names for similar things. I can't tell you what to think, but I think it's important to kind of understand why teams choose to name things themselves. This is a really great blog post from Unit 42 where Ryan Olson, one of the leads over there, talks about why they decided on the Unit 42 team to use their own names for different groups they're tracking. I actually really liked, and I'm a little sad they went to this because, right, they started out with a simple policy for group naming that I actually recommend. I think it's a good one for many teams to use. There was already some name that people used for something out there. The Unit 42 team would just use that name, right? So they've had blog posts about Sophacy, etc. If there was no name for whatever they're tracking, they would make a new one. Seems pretty simple. And if there are other names that people refer to that group by, they would include them in their reporting. Again, I think this is a really solid approach. What Ryan talks about here, and I think it's a really interesting one, is that over time, this became tougher and tougher, right? Because sometimes if researchers say, okay, we're going to track Sophacy, and they start tracking Sophacy, and then they find, hey, there's some other data that maybe the person who first started tracking Sophacy doesn't have. There's the debate of, well, do you call it something different? Do you keep calling it Sophacy? What do you call it? So this is a huge challenge that is not going to resolve itself, right? Michael asking, why don't they delegate the naming convention to MITRE? Well, MITRE, assuming you mean a MITRE attack, right? MITRE also does not have all of the visibility on all of the things, right? If you've seen the MITRE attack groups page, right, they try to track overlapping names and referencing those, but really tough. Only really the team who named each of these knows what data they used for that. And for good reasons, they might not share that publicly. So I've talked much more about this. Let me see if I can remember the name of my own thing. I'll find it later. I'll tweet it out later. I've talked about this in a previous STAR webinar, actually. The challenge of clustering, creating group names. So this is something that I think will continue being a challenge for many organizations. My recommendation is think about what makes sense for your team. Do you want to use other people's names? Is that good enough? And then I think the real thing to focus on is just, why do you care? Do you really care what name it is? Or do you care about the techniques and procedures the adversaries are using? Right? Do you care about how to protect your org? So the naming thing, it's going to continue being a challenge. So I recommend thinking about for your team what makes sense for you and realizing that different things work for different teams. All right. As we start to get towards the top of the hour, I briefly wanted to mention some research from ESET. The Mac OS malware ecosystem is something that doesn't get a whole lot of love. There is Mac malware. I will say that it's very different than the Windows malware ecosystem. But some research from ESET I thought was worth highlighting because it kind of specifically targeted individuals in our community, right? The Mac malware was disguised as a job description for Coinbase on a job for engineering manager product security. Kind of interesting. And ESET researchers attributed this back to the Lazarus Group, which is sort of an umbrella term for anything North Korea. So this one's interesting. There's a dark reading post that kind of discusses it a little bit more, in addition to that Twitter thread. So this was something that they found uploaded to VirusTotal and were able to attribute this back to North Korean actors. And kind of an interesting one to keep an eye out for. We have seen Lazarus Group, various North Korean actors trying to target security researchers in the past. So the good news is, right, Apple revoked the certificate for this specific malware, but definitely worth thinking about if this is something that might be important to your organization. How could you detect this? So, interesting, quick example of some Mac malware. Yes, Mac malware does exist. All right, we've covered a ton, and I have to thank Stephen, who's been copying and pasting all of those links so you all can follow along. As we start to wrap up, a couple more things I wanted to just share with you briefly. This is from my personal blog, but I thought it's probably worth sharing. Um, Over a year ago, I started out with a cyber threat intel self study plan. And my goal here is just to bring together a bunch of resources for people who are trying to learn about cyber threat intel. There's a lot out there, and released a second part to this covering for a couple topics, including some of the stuff we talked about today, right? Clustering, naming groups, pivoting. And so this might be a useful resource for you or someone you know who's trying to learn more about cyber threat intel. So I wanted to call that one out. Also wanted to highlight for the ransomware lovers, all of the YouTube videos from the ransomware summit that was a couple months ago are now online. So if you want to watch presentations about ransomware for hours on end, we've got you covered. Those are all available. A couple things on the SANS side wanted to highlight as well. Cyber Threat 2022. This is a really cool conference in London that is coming up in just a few weeks. And I'm going to be going to London. I'm super excited. I really love tea. So, London, totally my jam. If you can't make it to London, though, the good news is this is free online. So, you can register for free for this Cyber Threat Summit. I'm going to be talking a little bit about creating groups. So, I'll be presenting a lot of other really smart folks. This is a fun one because I find I'm based in the US. I often get a really US focused perspective of things. Probably a good idea to break out of my thinking, surround myself with some folks from Europe, from other parts of the world who have different perspectives on cyber threats. And then just wanted to remind everyone, right? Course I teach, Forensics 578, Cyber Threat Intelligence. We've got a bunch of runs of that coming up. Virginia, if you're in Northern Virginia, Amsterdam, waitlisted, Rocky Mountain, Paris. I wish I was teaching that one. I'll be teaching in Northern Virginia at the end of October. Lots of different runs of that coming up. And for those of you who like to plan ahead, I'll also be teaching in Washington, D.C. at SANS Cyber Defense Initiative, CDI, in December. So if you want to attend Forensics 578, hope to see you there. If that's not your jam, hopefully the self-study plan helps you out if you like to study on your own. Whew, I feel like an auctioneer talking so much. That's all I've got for you today, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for this month's live stream. Love to hear feedback. If there are topics you want to hear, if there are guests you want me to invite next month, please reach out. Twitter, LinkedIn, great places to find me. With that, that's all I've got. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day and month. See you next time.